Welcome to the Brunel Public Webinar Series. Today we're discussing viral apocalypse and other people, a talk that will consider the pandemic as an apocalyptic narrative, leaning on insights from both the sociology of religion and of risk. We're joined today by Dr. Hauke Riesch, a lecturer of sociology at Brunel, who before joining us completed a PhD on scientists' views on the philosophy of science at UCL, worked as a research associate at Cambridge on the public understanding of risk and energy policy, and more recently at Imperial College on public understanding of environmental change. So you're clearly not afraid of the big topics, Hauke. So let's dive in. Over to you.
All right, okay. Thank you very much, and thanks everybody for coming. So I've been working on risk, public understanding of risk for quite a while. I recently got into the idea of studying the apocalypse as a kind of narrative framework for looking at risk, or kind of the big global environmental and existential risks that people are kind of worried about these days. So I've been starting to think about how these kind of global risks can be thought about as kind of apocalyptic risks. And once you kind of start looking at apocalyptic calls and millennial movements through history, and you see kind of the way we talk about climate change or nuclear war and so on, you see certain parallels, right? And this is what got me interested in kind of the whole idea of the apocalypse. So this is just a brief outline of what I want to talk about. I want to kind of introduce apocalypse and the virus. I'm going to try to persuade you that there is a kind of clear and kind of intuitive connection between the two. I'm going to talk about some of my ideas about how apocalyptic narrative is kind of being developed in kind of this mostly secular setting of the pandemic. And then I go through apocalypse and the other, and kind of the sociologist uses the other with a capital O. And I'm talking through kind of the plain narrative that has been developed as part of kind of the sociology of risk. And then a couple of concluding remarks about kind of how we are always kind of striving to find some kind of meaning, even in kind of the big godless events like climate change or pandemics. Now, as I said, I've started this whole thing kind of thinking I'd write a big book about climate change, which I'm kind of at the moment doing. But then things happen, and my attention is kind of directed at other things. So when Sebastian asked me to present something in the public seminar series, I thought, like everybody else, let's do something about the main big issue of the day, which is obviously the virus. So one of these things that I can find really peculiar about the situation we're finding ourselves in at the moment is that it's global, right? So like climate change, like the Cold War is kind of a thing, a kind of worry that kind of is on everybody's mind. It's not just everybody's mind in this country, it's everybody's mind all around the world in some way or another, right? And these kind of global risks are kind of really, really rare. Even previous pandemics have not reached this kind of globalized attention. Together with the kind of big globality of the virus, it's also kind of precipitated kind of very sudden changes in our way of life. From one day to the other, we've been having to adapt to kind of a whole new way of living, and also never really had any kind of clear indication of when this is going to end, or is this going to be a permanent change now? Are we ever going to back to kind of shaking each other's hands, or is this gone for good? Right. So with the globality comes the suddenness and the kind of momentousness of the change that we're facing. We don't really know exactly how it's going to end. We don't know what's going to be on the other side of the whole crisis. Will we ever kind of live the normal life again, or will there be a kind of new normal? Right. So in this sense, the virus, I think, is a completely different type of thing than any kind of previous things that I could have written about. And I think even that includes even climate change, because climate change is something that we can deny very easily. We can just kind of shut our eyes and continue as normal. It's obviously exactly what lots of people are doing with the virus. We do not have that option, right? Even though I'm kind of conscious that many people are trying to do that. But kind of you already all know this, right? This is kind of one of the very few academic situations where kind of I'm giving a talk about things that everybody already kind of knows, right? You all know exactly what it feels like to be living in this particular moment in time, right? And this is what I think makes it so susceptible to being an apocalyptic narrative. Because on one hand, we know the apocalypse means it's the end of the world, right? But kind of on a kind of rational level, we know this is not the end of the world. It's not even the end of civilization. It's not even, well, any kind of end. It's just a huge change in the way we live. Together with that, we have this immediate kind of mental link between the apocalypse and what we're living through, which I think we can see kind of every day we open the newspapers, we see some kind of allusion to doomsday or the apocalypse in some way. Right? So you can see here, that's from a Swiss newspaper. If you don't read German, it says, "Praise the apocalypse. Corona is not the end of the world, it's just a challenge." Right? So even newspaper articles that explicitly deny that this is an apocalypse still talk about the apocalypse, right? So, and by the very act of trying to deny it, they're kind of and confirming the connection in our consciousness, right? Washington Post a couple of months ago had a long article about prepping for coronavirus being just like prepping for doomsday, right? Where the writer saw the parallels between kind of the doomsday preppers that are kind of a subculture in the United States and what it feels like to be living through the coronavirus crisis. And you can see with the cartoon that I started this talk with, you see plenty of kind of newspaper cartoons that kind of poke fun at this association as well with the virus or the pandemic appearing as the fourth horseman of the apocalypse, or sometimes an additional fifth horseman of the apocalypse, right? The connection in this case is very, very clearly that the Bible talks about pestilence as being one of the signs for the end of the world. And in some interpretations of the book of Revelation, one of the horsemen is identified as pestilence, as disease and plague, right? So this association comes very natural to us, right? Both on kind of the humorous side and also on kind of any wider kind of commentary side, like you see in the Washington Post there. So this kind of does not necessarily come as a complete surprise to me. This is kind of a general kind of way in which people try to make sense of any kind of new and unfamiliar concepts that just invaded their lives, like a pandemic. Any kind of new and unfamiliar concept gets made sense of by being anchored through to things that we have previously understood. Right? There's a kind of social psychological mechanism that's been described in the theory of social representations by Serge Moscovici and others, who developed a whole kind of theory about how our new concepts are being fitted, or they say anchored into already understood narratives or ideas that we have. A kind of similar concept comes from German philosophy and Hans Blumberg, who writes about the persistence of myth, right? Why is it that kind of the myths that we have kept telling ourselves throughout our history are always cropping up again? It's through a mechanism that is kind of similar, because we see new situations and we anchor them to the myths, to the legends, to the kind of understanding that we already have about the world. And then this understanding also filters through into how we make sense of the new concept. I hope that makes sense anyway. So our kind of ideas about the apocalyptic can be fitted into how we talk about the virus, kind of through several ways. All right, so kind of there's a whole lot of kind of narrative tropes about the apocalyptic that's been passed down through kind of various generations. The apocalyptic, we all kind of associate it with the end of the world, but it's not always entirely the complete end of the world. There is, in the kind of apocalyptic narrative, usually something that comes afterwards, right? And if we read, for example, Revelations, you see that the apocalyptic is just one moment in time, pivotal moment in time, but after the apocalypse, you know, Satan gets chained for 1,000 years, and there's a 1,000 years long period of peace afterwards. Right, and at the end of those 1,000 years, there's another struggle, and then Satan gets banished for good, and then we have the post-apocalyptic period of the city of God. All right, so the post-apocalyptic period is you know, one that's kind of very much ingrained in our understanding of what the apocalypse is. And you can see these kind of allusions being made quite a lot in kind of newspaper coverage as well, right? Where writers, for example, George Monbiot here, seeing the coronavirus crisis as the needed catalyst, or the catalyst that we need in order to build the better society, right? So coronavirus is a crisis, but we can use the crisis to build a better world. I also can see kind of the post-apocalyptic or the millennial discourse filtering through in all kind of the jokes and commentaries people have made about you know, nature healing itself. Right now that everybody's staying at home for 2 months, and all of a sudden the ghosts come out on the streets. Right, this is nature healing itself. It just takes the virus apocalypse for nature to come back. Right. Now, it didn't quite happen this way, right? And now that the lockdowns are easing, nature is in retreat again. But this is the kind of hope, the post-apocalyptic hope that people have invested into the coronavirus. Other things to note, right? It's the pivotal moment in history, right? This should be kind of fairly obvious, right? But it's also struggle of good versus evil, right? This is kind of one of the main points in the apocalyptic narrative, right? There is good versus evil, right? The end comes about between, as you know, as a struggle between God on one hand and Satan, Antichrist, and the beast on the other. Right, so this good versus evil is another kind of narrative trope that we kind of pin onto coronavirus as a kind of apocalyptic narrative. Now I would say, you know, in my kind of previous work I've done, we can see the kind of struggle of good versus evil in our narratives about climate change and our narratives about nuclear war. Right? So you can see any kind of modern secularized apocalypse has this inherent narrative that you know we took over basically from you know our long history of Christian understanding, Christian religion. So I want to kind of use this talk a little bit to talk about where can we see the struggle between good and evil in the coronavirus crisis, where, you know, ostensibly there is no God, there is no devil, there is no higher meaning to it, right? First of all, I kind of wanted to just kind of outline a little bit of kind of the sociology of the apocalypse. So one of the big questions in the kind of apocalyptic studies is that you know, we know that we have been expecting the imminent end for the last 3,000 years, right? All the way through ancient Judaism, then with Christianity as a kind of very apocalyptic religion, and then 2,000 years of Christianity and various sects and denominations within Christianity periodically expecting the end to be imminent, right? So we all know about these millennial expectations, right? They've all been frustrated at some point because obviously, as we know, the world hasn't ended yet. So one of the big questions is, given that every single prophecy about the end has been frustrated at some point, why is it still so attractive for us to see the end to be very much in the near future? And I put up two books here, book covers here that I've read recently. They're kind of very much non-religious, right? to kind of show you that, you know, even we can get rid of God, but we can't really get rid of the imminent sense of doom about the future. All right, so Martin Rees, the astronomer, who has a couple of years ago co-founded co-founded the Center for Existential Risk Research in Cambridge. He's written several books now. This is the one I've read about kind of our existential risks, the final century, as he calls it. And this is, you know, the list of risks that you should be familiar with, whether it's climate change, it's nuclear war, it's the AI apocalypse is something that's become on the radar recently. Well, these are all kind of very secularized risks, right? Risks that we still kind of expect can cause civilization to collapse. All right. So this is, you know, a kind of ongoing research project, you know, existential risk, about, you know, how, you know, we are kind of need to be very conscious about the world ending very soon in order for us to do something about it, right? But this is kind of still, I would say, kind of a clearly apocalyptic discourse. I'm not saying they're wrong, but the discourse in which this appears is, you know, part of a long line of kind of millennial expectations about the end. The other book there is by the, you know, recently ex-MP, Tory MP Oliver Letwin, who wrote a book called Apocalypse How, right? Which is not really about the apocalypse, it's more about, you know, how we should manage and kind of a sudden system failure in a kind of modern day technology. The scenario that Letwin imagined was, you know, what if, you know, our internet connection worldwide kind of gets wiped out, you know, for 5 days? How would we manage? Lots of people would die because there'll be people missing appointments to hospitals, people not really being able to seek immediate help for things that they need, right? So in this sense, right, it's not really about the apocalypse. What I found interesting about Letwin's book is that he had to put apocalypse into the title, maybe as a way of selling it, but also maybe as this is kind of the way that he himself saw the problem as an apocalyptic one. So in this sense, you know, I think we can even see kind of risk management failure as being an apocalyptic theme. Certainly discuss, you know, big, large-scale risk management failures in terms of the apocalyptic. Which leads to the sociology of religion. I kind of promised I wanted to talk a little bit about, right? What makes the apocalypse so attractive or persuasive? Yeah, as I said, I'm kind of interested in kind of secular apocalypses, right? But what can we learn from the sociology of religion that will give us some kind of insights into why people find apocalypse so attractive, right? The classic account is Norman Cohn's 1960s book about, you know, the pursuit of the millennium. He adapts a kind of a generalized idea from the sociology of religion about why people are attracted to religions in the first place. That's kind of relative deprivation, right? People who are deprived relative to the norm of the society are more susceptible to joining religious groups because that gives them, you know, kind of the sense of belonging that they need in order to actually feel good about their place in society. All right. This is then, Cohn argues, particularly so for apocalyptic cults. Apocalyptic cults or movements give kind of the relatively deprived members of society the hope that, you know, while things are not going to be better this life, they will be very soon in the afterlife, right? Michael Bakun notice this is that, you know, relative deprivation is maybe one factor, but it can't be everything because we also get, you know, lots of very rich and secure people interested in apocalyptic religion, right? So he says, you know, in order for us to have an apocalyptic movement in society, we need to have some kind of social disorientation caused by some kind of disaster like a stock market collapse or a war or a famine. And then finally, Stephen O'Leary has written a rhetorical account about how we persuade people to take the apocalyptic seriously. Right? He writes about the topos of time, authority, and evil. Right? All kind of very interesting. I'm particularly interested in the topos of evil. O'Leary is talking here particularly about the problem of evil, or theodicy. Right? The problem of evil is basically how, if God is all benevolent and all omnipotent, how can God allow evil to exist in the world? Right? This is a problem that theologians have been discussed ever since monotheism became a thing. Right? O'Leary says that the apocalyptic is one particular very neat solution to the problem of evil, because it's basically saying, well, God is doing something about evil, right? God is doing something about evil. He'll actually destroy the whole world, and there'll be a judgment day, and then evil people will be judged, and good people, righteous people will get their just rewards. So in order for the apocalypse to be a kind of plausible, kind of persuasive solution to the problem of evil, we need the apocalypse to be very much imminent. So I'll kind of return to evil later on, because it's kind of this kind of, as I said, this kind of the sort of thing I'm interested in. Where do we actually see evil in kind of a secularized society? Personally, for me, kind of one of the most interesting accounts of kind of why people are so susceptible to thinking that the apocalypse is imminent comes from the literary scholar Frank Kermode, writing in the 1960s or something like that. And Kermode is not really particularly interested in explaining this this question so much, but for me, that was kind of almost a throwaway part of his whole book that caught my attention. So he basically posits the idea that everybody accounts their own lives as a kind of big main narrative, with our own lives, or ourselves being the main character in the narrative that we tell about the world, right? Because I'm the center of the world, clearly, because I'm in everything I perceive, I am there as the main character, right? So we all individually go through the world perceiving ourselves as the main character of the world history, right? The problem is that the world has been going on for quite a long time, right? And our own little lives are very insignificant time-wise in comparison to the huge amount of time that the world exists, right? So one way in which we can make ourselves kind of really relevant and kind of build ourselves into the story of the world as one of the main characters is to situate ourselves right at the kind of very pivotal moment when we sit at the the apex of history, when the world will end, or the world will catastrophically change into a better one, right? So we are all kind of psychologically predisposed towards seeing ourselves at exactly the kind of pivotal moment of time that we need to be in order to be the main character of our story, of the story of the world, right? And this is then his explanation of why we are kind of also convinced that the end of the world is kind of really imminent. To which I would add, we also we set ourselves apart from kind of the lives of previous generations through this means, but we also kind of need to find ways of setting ourselves apart from people within our generation, right? So I kind of would add that this might make a neat explanation for kind of the rise of conspiracy theories, right? Because we also set ourselves apart from others by having access to special knowledge, right? We are part of a small select group that knows what's going on, right? So we can shape history, right? Now, me, obviously, as an academic, I feel like this all the time, right? This is a occupational hazard, right? But this knowledge can be scientific, it can be academic, but can also be religiously revealed, right? Knowledge that we are part of a kind of very special congregation of a very special religion that knows the truth. And then finally, also shows itself, I think, in kind of proliferation of conspiracy theories that we've seen sprung up throughout the COVID crisis, right? With 5G conspiracies, for example, right? These are appealing because they kind of put us in kind of a special position of knowledge, right? That sets us apart from everybody else, that makes us tell the story of the world with us, again, as one of the main characters of the story. right? So in this sense, we can see there's a kind of a link between conspiracy theories and the millennium and the apocalyptic. And, I wouldn't, be the first person to kind of spot the link between conspiracy theory and millennium, right? In the 40 years ago, Hofstadter, for example, wrote a kind of very famous and influential essay about conspiracy theories in the United States and kind of the paranoid frame of politics in the United States and how that links to, the millennial experiences of the hundreds of little evangelical denominations that exist in the United States that all in their own ways expect the end of the world to come very soon. So I'm kind of really interested in kind of using the sociology of risk as a way of kind of to explain kind of where we find evil in our secularized apocalypse. All right. It's going to one of the main theories in sociology of risk is the risk society and kind of reflexive modernity thesis by sociologist Ulrich Beck in Germany and Anthony Giddens here in the UK. Right? And they see kind of late modern society, the society that we are kind of living in at the moment, as a risk society. Risk has become one of the fundamental framing devices through which we see society functioning. Right, that's their thesis. So our modern society is kind of very much framed through, the big, large, globalized risks like climate change, biodiversity loss, nuclear war, that kind of shape the way we think and talk about the future. Now, crucially, they say this kind of modern risk society is reflexive, right? That means that we're not just aware of the risks in ways that previous societies maybe weren't, but we're also kind of aware that these risks are ones that we have brought upon ourselves, right? We think about all the kind of late modern risks that Beck writes about, but also the ones that Martin Rees writes about a couple of slides earlier. These are the ones that we are at fault for. Climate change is our fault, right? Nuclear war quite clearly is our fault. Biodiversity loss is our fault, right? And even in risks that are not our fault, right? Risks that kind of in previous ages could have been said to be an act of God are now our fault in some other kind of way. That gives the example of the Hurricane Katrina. Right, Hurricane Katrina is sort of ostensibly a kind of very natural event, right? Nobody caused a hurricane in that sense, right? But the suffering that was caused by Hurricane Katrina was clearly the fault of somebody, right? It was either the fault of the federal government for not maintaining the levees, right? It was the fault of individual people for not heeding evacuation orders, or it was the fault of maybe the whole of society for making such extreme weather events more likely through allowing climate change to happen. In some way, even though Hurricane Katrina was a natural event, we found ways of blaming somebody for it. And in this sense, right, you see, I put up a picture of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, right? In this way, our kind of modern risk society is actually echoing a type of narrative that we have been telling ourselves throughout history in some way or other, right? This is kind of the dangerousness of knowledge and technological innovation, right? Knowledge is inherently dangerous. This is one of the kind of narrative tropes that we have inherited, right? Knowledge, for example, in Genesis, right, was associated with the fall from paradise, right? So just the act of knowing things that you shouldn't have known was an evil in itself. Well, in this kind of danger of knowledge story has been told and retold over the centuries, right? There's the Promethean myth of the god who steals fire and gives it to the humans and gets punished by the gods for giving humans forbidden knowledge, right? There's the story of Dr. Faustus, who makes a deal with the devil in order to gain knowledge, right, and sells a soul. There's Mary Shelley's story of Frankenstein, very much the first kind of completely secular retelling of the Prometheus myth, right? We don't actually need gods or God or fate in order to tell the Promethean story. The whole act of innovating and seeking knowledge in areas that are kind of forbidden is going to backfire on us by us creating a monster, right? Or a creature that we cannot control, right? Or us creating a creature that obviously, as in Mary Shelley's original Frankenstein, is to be pitied, right? But in both cases, it is a wrong thing to have done. Well, and this kind of wrath of God Promethean story has been told and retold all the way through, and you can still see it in Jurassic Park, you can see it in Terminator, and kind of lots of kind of modern day science fiction stories, that the act of creating new technology, the act of knowledge creation, is inherently dangerous, right? And this is the way we anchor our conception of a lot of the kind of late modern risks like climate change or nuclear war that we produce. Now, another kind of big theory, sociology of risk, or in this case, kind of social anthropology of risk, is from Mary Douglas, who's spent her whole career writing about risk and blame. Right? So Mary Douglas was very interested in the purity and dirt taboos of kind of various societies, right? Analyzing exactly what kind of taboos people have, various cultures and societies have, right, that are to do with purity and dirt, and then kind of extrapolating from that kind of how these dirt taboos kind of get handled when they get broken. Right, so one of the main insights was that the dirt taboos that any given society has might be in origin a kind of real and tangible risk. So, for example, we might have dirt taboos about eating or not eating certain foods because certain foods might be seen as dangerous, right? The origin might be kind of very much that these foods are more dangerous for us to eat, right? So many societies have dirt taboos about eating seafood, for example, because seafood gets off very quickly and makes us very sick if we eat it out of date, right? So lots of dirt taboos have this kind of origin, but her insight is that actually it's the ritualization of these dirt taboos that make them, dirt taboos, right? So we have a possible origin, but it's not always an origin in kind of real tangible danger. But what we really have in these kind of dirt taboos is rules of things that are out of place, or rules of things that break our bodily boundaries, right? They are inherently dangerous. Things being out of place are inherently dangerous. Breaking bodily boundaries is inherently dangerous, right? Because that's how I get killed if my body gets broken in some way, right? But it's not the actual risk that is the taboo. It's the things being out of place that is the taboo, right? So one of the examples she gives is that, if you have a shoe, for example, you walk around a shoe is not dirty in any kind of real sense. But if you put this shoe on your dinner table, then it becomes dirty because this shoe is out of place, right? And you can do the experiment of buying completely new shoes out of the shop and then putting it on your mom's dinner table and see how she reacts, right? There's no real dirt being introduced on the dinner table, but it's the breaking of the taboo that has its origin maybe in real risk. That is breaking the boundary. Right, and it's also kind of the breaking of bodily boundaries here, which means that many of our kind of dirt taboos are in some way related to the fluids that come in and out of our bodies, like menstrual blood, other kind of blood, semen, vomit, right? All the kind of things that have their own space become dirt when they get out of their own allotted rightful space, right? So breaking a dirt taboo, Douglas says, is introducing a particular danger to the community. It's not really anymore about kind of introducing real tangible danger. It's about breaking the taboo that might have been a danger at some other stage, but it's the taboo that's introducing the risk into our society. And the second insight that she had is that in kind of many ways that that we think about our society as a kind of microcosm of the individual body. That also means that breaking societal, social boundaries is analogous to breaking of bodily boundaries. As an example, if we often have kind of metaphorical languages about society that takes society as an individual body. So we might talk about terrorism, for example, being a cancer on our society, right? Or in war times, country invading a country, another country becomes a country raping and pillaging another country. So it follows from this that really all other societies or culture are by nature dangerous, right? Because every country has different habits in their culinary, sexual, and hygienic practices, right? Because they are just different cultures, right? So they're natural habits that are natural for people in other societies become taboo-breaking habits for us, right? And our habits are taboo-breaking for them. So other cultures are inherently dangerous. What I find interesting about infectious disease outbreaks, like the virus that we're living through at the moment, is that they're themselves inherently breaking both individual bodily boundaries and also societal boundaries, right? And therefore, kind of these infectious disease outbreaks lend themselves very much to the kind of stereotype projection that we have of other cultures, right? Other cultures have broken some kind of hygienic or sexual or culinary taboo, and therefore introducing the risk into our society. We can look at the history of infectious diseases, and we can see that they have always been, almost always been named by their country of origin, right? You have German measles, Spanish flu, Mexican swine fever, Middle East respiratory syndrome. Now we've got the Wuhan virus, right? Joffe, for example, makes the case that syphilis, when it was introduced in the 16th century, was first known in the UK, or in England at the time, as the French disease. The French people named it the German disease, right? Florentines named it the Neapolitan disease, the Chinese named it the Japanese disease, and so on, right? It's always somebody else's fault. The disease is always comes into our culture from somebody else. And this particular culture from which it comes tends to be one that we already have quite a lot of negative stereotypes about, because they just happen to be our neighbors. If you see the picture here, I took on a picture that's very familiar these days, right? Because we see pictures about people in face masks every day, right? But this particular picture was actually taken in 2003 during the original SARS epidemic. You can see the way the original SARS epidemic was framed in Western newspapers was very much an image of Chinese people, and it was always Chinese people wearing face masks, right? So it's always the association with China and Chinese food habits that was seen as responsible for the SARS outbreak. So a couple of papers I've read at the time have already pinpointed the anti-China xenophobia behind Western discussions about the original SARS outbreak. And we've seen exactly the same kind of discourses happening with the coronavirus outbreak, certainly in January and February, when it was still fairly new. Much of the discourse that we heard about the virus was the kind of xenophobic discourse about Chinese people being unclean in their food habits, being unclean in their culinary practices, which then foisted the virus onto us. So you see, in some sense, kind of which particular taboo-breaking behavior we see causes the disease and the attendant suffering of the disease kind of very much depends on who our main outgroup is, right? Are we talking about, are we Westerners looking over at China, or maybe are we Chinese people looking over at Westerners, right? It depends on what our cultural taboos are and the perception of the bodily practices of other people, right? I find it kind of very interesting that we fairly early on during the lockdown, or even before the lockdown, we cottoned on to the toilet paper shortages so quickly, right? Because the toilet paper is at the end kind of a hygienic practice. So rather than pasta or flour or any of the potatoes missing from the shop shelves, it is toilet paper that informed most of our jokes, right? Scatological habits of other people. Again, that is kind of then at fault for introducing the risk to our own in-group. So where exactly we see the in-group, so where exactly we see the blame, for the suffering of the virus depends very much on who we see as our in-group, who our kind of own little culture is, and also who are the main out-groups and what we think about their hygienic, sexual, and culinary practices. So we can make kind of several observations, right? So the talk is about that one Chinese person who ate a bat, right? Again, this is kind of a stereotypical projection about unnatural foods that we can imagine other people to eat. That is at fault for the whole outbreak, right? But also we see, if you follow Chinese discourse or you see, their xenophobia towards us as kind of an explanation for, for the virus, right? It's Western repression, sexual habits that are at cause, the cause for the virus. So xenophobia, us towards other people, but also other people towards us, as a kind of main kind of worldwide thing, is unfortunately one of those things that people grapple towards when they try to find meaning in the whole thing, right? Our political alignment plays a role, right? Because we've seen, especially in the United States, that the whole coronavirus thing has become part of the culture war, right? So depending on which side of the culture war you see yourself, right, that's where you also see the fault for the virus. So it's the fault of the government that is incompetent, right? Or it's the opposition that's incompetent, right? It's those Brexiters or the MAGA people, right? Or on the other side, it's the Ramonas, the liberals, lefties, right? Whichever way we sit, we see the fault for the virus with the others. And then obviously there's also the conspiracy theories, right? Where the others is just this big disembodied thing that we don't have a clear handle on, but it's certainly their fault, the New World Order, 5G, Big Pharma, scientists in Western labs who introduced the virus in order to repress Chinese economic development, all these things. So what these all have in common, right? They are the outgroups, they are not us. They are kind of breaking taboos in some way, not necessarily related to virus, though that helps. The taboo can be anything that's broken and still introduces a tangible risk to our society. So this is kind of what I'm trying to argue, is this is where we can see the evil discourse in the apocalyptic of the coronavirus, right? The evil is not necessarily a theological concept now, but it is something that we project onto other people through their taboo-breaking behaviors. Therefore, kind of, end this with, the quote from Nietzsche, that God is dead and we have killed him. I'm not a Nietzsche scholar, so, don't expect particular insight from this, but, God is dead, right? We have killed him, but also, what people don't quote about Nietzsche is kind of the development afterwards, is that, man has taken the place of God, right? Therefore also man has taken the place of evil. So if you want to find meaning in the virus, the apocalyptic meaning in the virus, we find evil where we need to find it, right? And this, in our case, happens to be anybody but me. Right, and that's it, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Hauke. That was fascinating. I must confess I was Googling along with you there while I was trying to catch up on some of that. Terrific. I'm going to dive straight into questions. So please do send your questions through via the Q&A function, though I can catch them on the chat as well. We have one here, two, so I'll connect them. This appears to be the first socially mediated apocalypse. And with that comes an overwhelming amount of information. And so how does that affect the narrative?
It's a good question. I don't know. It's very good question. And obviously, kind of the ubiquitous of social media is something that's kind of fairly new, right? And I'm sometimes a little bit skeptic of kind of sociology saying, this changes everything, right? Because really, kind of the whole kind of in-group, out-group, stereotype projections kind of stuff that we've been talking about, that people have been engaging with in that for ages, right? So that's part of human nature, and I don't think socially mediated, the social media explosion alters that. It might alter the way it manifests itself, right? It might make the whole thing a little bit kind of more faster moving, a bit more aggressive. Yeah, certainly. So I think it's a good question. I would like to look into this. Yeah.
It's
that answer. So,
yeah, I mean, no, not at all. It's certainly it adds to the spectacle and the apocalyptic sort of feel and nature of it, the proliferation of information, the content coming at you at all ends. And there was a point picked up. Is it knowledge that is dangerous, or the interpretation of it by individuals or groups and society in general, which feeds into that same point?
I think, so certainly I don't think knowledge is dangerous, right? So what I've been trying to say is that this is kind of the narrative that has been building around knowledge, and that people might disagree with all the time, but it's still something in the back of our mind, because that's the kind of stories and that's the legends we've been telling ourselves, right? So in that sense, I don't think knowledge is dangerous. I don't think interpretation of knowledge necessarily is dangerous, right? And even if a whole group of people don't think knowledge is dangerous, this kind of narrative trope still informs the way kind of we think about knowledge. This might not make entire sense. So what I mean is, like, if we want to entertain ourselves, right, we can read Jurassic Park as fiction or as a movie, right? Being completely fine with genetic technology, but this is still entertaining, right? And it's entertaining because it harks back to the narrative tropes that we recognize, right? So even if we don't actually agree with it, we still entertain ourselves with it. So therefore, kind of it kind of keeps coming back to kind of the top of the mind, right? So, if you think about climate change, for example, right, it's, there is a huge kind of sub-narrative about climate change that is kind of really about, climate change is the fault of Western technology, right? I don't think many people actually hold to this view. It is there, but not many people hold to this view, right? But I think everybody will kind of recognize that climate change is a consequence of our technological development, right? So even though knowledge or technology itself is not dangerous, we know that the biggest dangers we face at the moment, they are technological in nature, right? So that's the connection, I think. I hope that makes sense, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mentioned this to you earlier, and I feel bad because you didn't read it, but I'm going to bring it up anyway. Right. There was an article in The Guardian today about sort of the psychological perception of this experience being better processed by those who've fans of apocalyptic films and horror films. And I wonder if that's turning to climate change that you studied. Is there some element where this experience might help us to begin to process the risks and the otherness of climate change, and to sort of face the emergency more successfully, for want of a better word?
Yes and no. I mean, I still have to read it. I still have to read the article once. You need to send it to me if I don't find it. It makes kind of sense, right? So, you all kind of process new information. Like I said, we all process new information by kind of making it relevant to something that we already know and understand. So in that sense, if you want people to understand the urgency of climate change, you need to make it relevant to, our own previous understanding of the world, right? Because otherwise it's a completely alien concept and we just don't know what to do with it. But I think with it comes a risk also of kind of trivializing it, right? And this is one big thing. So this is one thing I've been grappling with, right? If everybody knows science fiction is kind of this basically trivial entertainment, right? I enjoy science fiction, but I'm under no illusion, as to how serious the genre is being taken, right? So everybody kind of sees this as kind of a trivialized way of kind of entertaining, right? Also, we've got, as I said, we've got the 3,000 or at least 2,000 years of experience of always predicting the end of the world and never coming, right? So making allusions to the apocalyptic too soon kind of trivializes it, because then we kind of put it back in its place as it's just another apocalyptic. And if you can, if you actually see some of the discourse that comes from the kind of climate change kind of denial side, you see people saying, well, this is just apocalyptic discourse, right? Isn't it? Right? People have been, I've seen it kind of actually written down like this. This is just, people have been predicting the end of the world all the time. What makes climate change different, right? So I think, you know, there's the danger there that actually trivializes is it as well.
Yeah.
I have to still read the article.
Maybe I'll send it to you, I promise. Yeah. What are your thoughts on what the effects upon apocalyptic thinking could be of a recognition among those immersed in apocalyptic narratives with their own role as the storyteller, as well as a character in the story? So could this reflective awareness of their role have an impact upon how they play that role or influence on the narratives?
Yeah, well, excellent. I think it would, yeah, it would do, right? So it kind of influences how kind of we individually kind of react to it. Yeah, I think that's kind of maybe also again kind of something that kind of breeds complacency, because, you know, at the end kind of we, you know, narrate our place in the world in a way that kind of makes sense to us. So, you know, us being kind of special, us having this access to special knowledge kind of also makes us complacent to kind of the feelings or the way other people feel about the same crisis, right? Yeah, I don't know. So I don't know whether I'm answering your question, sorry about that. But it's certainly something to think about, definitely.
I'm going to connect these next two questions, if I may. Firstly, do you think that blaming the other is one way to explain the world, particularly in a post-God? I mean, you mentioned Nietzsche, in a post-God world. And to make it even harder for you, how might this experience start welcoming the other, considering the other, because of this sort of global community of experience for COVID?
There's a whole kind of branch in this social psychology and social identity theory that has been developed around understanding, you know, how we can, you know, how we kind of project stereotypes onto the other, right? And, you know, it has been also developed kind of as you know, in the hope of, you know, us finding ways out of it. As far as I know, and, you know, I'm not a social psychologist really, so somebody correct me if you know better, but as far as I know, we haven't really found a magic answer yet, right? So we know how we can stoke divisions very clearly and quickly, but we don't really know how to undo it. You know, it's kind of, that's a bit of a scary thought, right? But, you know, I think maybe one thing that could help is that, you know, we all kind of get a little bit more familiar with in-groups, out-groups, social identity theory, kind of understanding that when we project stereotypes onto others, that's exactly what we are doing, right? Maybe that will help. So, you know, I see myself, right, in unguarded moments, you know, I'm part of my own little cultural group like everybody else, and I've got my own little cultural out-groups like everybody else, and I kind of tend to instinctively blame those people for, making everything worse, if not, you know, necessarily causing the virus, right? So I know exactly who I'm blaming for the, you know, things being so shit at the moment, right? But then, you know, I need to also reflect on my own little habits of thought and kind of say, well, you know, this is exactly the kind of social mechanism that, you know, I'm recognizing in others, right? So I think, you know, one of the best things that we can do is kind of basically educate ourselves about kind of the social habits of thoughts that gets us into these kind of situations. Now, making everybody understand this, that's not easy, right? And you know, the best I can do is kind of giving this type of talks and hope that, you know, people take that kind of message from it. It's not much. Sorry, the first question I forgot about.
Oh yeah, please go on.
Yeah. So that's about Nietzsche. Can you kind of repeat that?
The first question was, do you think that blaming blaming the others that you talked about is one way to explain the world and the mystery of the world to ourselves in a post-God world? Yeah,
it's one of several mechanisms, I think, that we have to kind of, you know, deal with the post-God world. I mean, there's several others. I've certainly, and this comes, you know, from the heart as a kind of atheist, I've come to the conclusion, for me personally anyway, that the whole kind of religion versus non-religion divide is a little bit of a non-goer in the first place, right? So religion or kind of God is just kind of a way we have of explaining what the world is explaining how the world works, right? We can get rid of God, but we still need some kind of explanatory framework, right? So it's a bit of a cliche to say that, you know, nature has become God, right? Instead of believing in God, we now believe in nature. Nature does this, nature does that, nature is good and benign, right? I don't even mean that so much. I think, you know, I don't think we've ever kind of got rid of God in the first place, right? Because God was really never there to begin with. This was always a kind of way of us trying to explain the world, right? And there's plenty of religions that don't actually have this, you know, monotheistic Christian God, right? So there are other ways of explaining the world out there, right? And kind of my atheist way of explaining the world is kind of one among many of these. So I mellowed out a little bit, you know, over the years. So I think that's...
I wanted to pick up on something you mentioned the previous question. This is my fault for combining things.
Yeah, sure.
And the sort of the hopeful element of how we might start rethinking and preventing ourselves from blaming others. And just as someone pointed out, in your talk about risk and the sort of taboos of the dirty, is it going to be in this sort of new normal? Is there going to be a taboo about shaking hands and about the cough that you hear down the street? And in some ways, I see that as quite a hopeful element. I wonder if you agree, if actually we have learned these new taboos quite effectively over a short period of time. Is that a sign of hope?
Possibly. I mean, the things that I expect to happen is that these kind of, I mean, if they really kind of get ingrained as kind of new taboos, then they will also become kind of ritualized and kind of lose the actual meaning behind it, right? You know, just maybe imagine in 200 years time when people don't shake hands anymore, right? Why do why is that, they might not actually, people might not realize that, touching each other's hands was perfectly acceptable, right? Because it's become a taboo now, right? So even if there's no pandemic going around and shaking hands, we're, perfectly hygienically fine, and that taboo might then persist. So I think there's the kind of danger of things kind of becoming ritualized and kind of losing the meaning, right? And then actually we're stuck with the taboo without the meaning.
That speaks to this next question. I'll read it word for word if I may. There's an anxiety in all of us now of change and coming face to face with death, the unknown land of being. So not so much as a concept, but as reality almost waiting to knock on our door, which brings forward the question of our sense of identity.
Yeah.
So, which is in itself, this question says, getting weaponized by the media for its own need.
It certainly is getting weaponized. Whether it's for the media's own need, I'm not 100% sure. I mean, there's certainly, plenty of cynical players around, right? So, people, you think we can exploit this to whatever, sell more newspapers. But I also think, maybe we need to kind of mellow out a little bit ourselves and kind of not project negative or nefarious motives on people we disagree with, right? There might just be people who disagree with us, right? So, just saying, so whatever the Daily Mail or, if you're on this side of the debate, right, or whatever the Guardian writes is bad and influenced by right-wing / left-wing ideology, I think that's a bit of a canard. I think quite a lot of people actually mean what they say, and you need to kind of engage with them on that level, right? I'm kind of veering off the point, right, because I like the media point so much, but, about identity, right? Yeah, and certainly, and the kind of the fear of death that kind of underlies everything. I think this is kind of what makes this issue so explosive, because it is, this kind of weird situation where it's intensely personal, right? The virus, but also kind of really intensely global, right? So it makes us all confront a fear of death, right? Yeah.
I do want to pick up on the sort of the ebbs and flows of apocalyptic moments. The financial crash, we were all talking about banking reform, and as far as I can tell, that hasn't happened, for example. So we are discussing now the green recovery. And is there some sort of element of this apocalyptic narrative that can help us to engage with a green recovery?
Yeah, I think it should. It'd be really great if it was some kind of catalyst for building a better society. I mean, just saying that it is one of the kind of recognized apocalyptic narrative tropes doesn't mean it's necessarily bad, right? And I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting to build a better world after the virus, or after climate change, or after whatever. No, I just say yes, I agree. Yeah, sorry.
No, that's great. Well, let's do that. Yeah, let's all go away and do that, please. I think mindful of the time, but thank you, Hauke, for a wonderful conversation and presentation.
Okay, thanks very much, and thanks for your patience, because I realized I kind of doubled the time I allowed myself to talk.
Not at all. It was a pleasure, and thank everyone for joining us. We'll see you all soon.
Bye.